Our keynote speaker this morning is Mr. Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh, as you know, was born in Bombay, India. And actually, I know I've had the privilege of traveling there on my first missionary trip to India. So I have a special love in my heart for people from India. Dinesh is one of the leading defenders of Christianity, who exposes the darkness of humanism and new atheism. He's the author of several books, including What's So Great About Christianity, and his most recent book, The Big Lie. By the way, his books will be available right here after, if you'd like a signed copy. Come up on the stage and he'll sign a book for you. And Alvidas. Yes. Don't forget that. So I'll clarify, Dinesh and Alvida are signing books after, okay? But yeah, as you know, Dinesh D'Souza, in the film industry, his films are among the largest political documentaries of all time. And alongside his books and movies, Dinesh's articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, and many other publications. You know, on a personal note, when I hear something about Dinesh D'Souza in the media or on TV, wherever it is, I immediately think of a Bible verse. Ephesians 5:13 pops in my mind every time. And it says, have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. That's what he does. Dinesh has a sense of duty and the courage to expose the fruitless deeds of darkness. It's a Christian responsibility to bring light into that darkness. And it usually takes some measure of risk. There's usually risk involved when you do that, right? And courage is needed if there's risk involved. And Dinesh has shown over and over and over, he has the courage to expose the darkness. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dinesh D'Souza.
Thank you very much. Wow. Look at this. I'm so excited and honored and also very moved to be here. I'm very pleased to be sharing the stage with Alvida King, who has been a champion of civil rights, but also and especially the civil rights cause of our time, which is the civil rights of the unborn. I was thinking as I thought about her ministry that the real tragedy of abortion is not merely that a woman kills a child. It is that a woman kills her own child. And how this can become commonplace and normalized and defended in a civilized society is something that I think future generations will have to ponder. We live at a time when compassion has become one of our leading virtues, political virtues even. We have a whole political party that emphasizes compassion, moist eyes, caring about the outsider. And yet, how ironic it is that when our reach of compassion goes toward the stranger, the outsider, the illegal immigrant, the guy in a faraway country, the famine in Haiti or in Mongolia, and yet somehow this circumference of compassion is not wide enough, apparently, to encompass the unborn right in front of us. I think we recognize every time we turn on the TV that we're living in a little bit of a crazy time. A surreal moment, you might say, in American history and in American politics. The pro-life issue actually itself illustrates that. I mean, you've actually got people who emphasize not only that abortion is a right, it's a right, by the way, that's nowhere in the Constitution, but they want it to be a right that is funded by the government, by the taxpayer. It's, they say, a basic right. Now, when you think about this, we recognize we have all these fundamental rights in the Constitution: the right to free speech, the right to freedom of religion, the Second Amendment, the right to freely assemble, to vote. Now think about this. Not a single one of those rights is actually funded by the government. You have a First Amendment right to free speech, but the government, the taxpayer, doesn't provide you with a newspaper or a magazine. You want to have a First Amendment right to practice your faith? You have to do it on your own time and with your own money. You have a Second Amendment right to own a firearm. You got to buy your own. You got to assemble on your own time and at your own expense. So the people who want to actually have government-funded abortion are not only saying it's a right, they're extending it to it a protection that none of our other basic rights even enjoys. They have, in a sense, you might almost say politically, made abortion into a sacrament. Into a sacrament. And that is the craziness of our time. You know, I realize that these issues are hotly debated. People say things like, I don't know when life begins. Who's to say when life begins? Well, frankly, if we don't know when life begins, one would think we would extend the benefit of the doubt to the unborn. It's kind of like if I was out in Texas with a bunch of guys and we're hunting and there's a movement in the leaves and it could be a deer or it could be my neighbor Bob. If I don't really know which it is, I don't exactly want to draw and shoot. So clearly, there's something big going on in America of which abortion is a reflection, is a kind of symbol. Now, I've been in the United States now for a generation. I came in 1978 as an exchange student. And we've seen in America in the last, really in my adult lifetime, what appears to be a kind of deep moral slide, a kind of erasure of all the moral boundaries of our society, almost an upside-down morality in which things that were taken for granted as wrong are now portrayed as right, and vice versa. What's really happening in America now, interestingly, it isn't just a decline of morality. I think what we've seen in America in the last generation is a real shift in the source of morality. And what I mean by this is that from the beginning of the nation, One could go back, let's say, from the founding, all the way through the 1950s and maybe even the early 60s. It was taken for granted in America that there is a moral order in the universe that is external to us, that makes claims on us. One could disagree about what this moral order is or what its particular codes and commandments are, but even if you take something like the Ten Commandments, the Ten Commandments was, until quite recently in our lifetime, taken to be the agreed upon moral basis of American society. You didn't even have to be a Christian. You could be Jewish, you could be a non-believer. If you went to an American in 1948 and said, do you agree that if you follow the Ten Commandments, you will be a better person? I believe 99% of all Americans would have answered to that question, yes. Yes. Now, this is not to say that everybody followed the Ten Commandments or the moral code, but it is to say that this moral code supplied an external standard against which we could measure our behavior, our conduct. Can we live up to this moral code? What's really changed in American society in the interim is that today, when people, particularly young people, and particularly in our mainstream culture, are trying to make a decision, and it doesn't even have to be a moral decision, it's any kind of decision. Should I go to law school or should I become a poet? Young people today, in trying to answer that question, don't consult an outside moral code. They actually don't feel that the ultimate determinant should come from their parents or their teacher or their preacher, and sometimes not even God. Instead, they dig within themselves into their inner being, you might say, and they look to the self as the ultimate arbiter of morality. The self becomes the adjudicator, the referee of what to do and what is right and what is wrong. So this just isn't just a different morality, this is a different source for morality. And a lot of the issues in the so-called culture war come out of that. The debate about gay marriage, for example. In the old days, you'd say there's a moral code. And here's what it says. And this is what marriage means. And this is who you are. And it is a given. It's given by God. It's given by nature. It's given by morality. But today there's a group of people that believes that what they feel from the inside, this inside self, you might say, trumps external morality. And so we live in this fractured society in which the external code and the inner self are sort of doing battle with each other. And this is another way of saying that a lot of the craziness of our politics and our debates arises because we've got these political issues out here, but underneath them we have moral issues. And underneath those we have spiritual warfare. So ultimately, we're fighting on three levels, each one deeper than the other. America used to be a society in which Christian assumptions were completely taken for granted. We live now in a secular society in which those assumptions are seen as strange, and in many sectors of our culture, they are under attack. And yet this is also bizarre because the very foundations of our society, and I mean our political system, the very concept of rights, including civil rights, these ideas come out of Christianity. Christianity brought them into the world. And we can actually test this by seeing that these values that even secular people take for granted in America didn't exist in pre-Christian society, and they don't exist today in the world in many places where Christianity is not present. You know, take something as simple as the value of compassion. We think it's a universal value, but that's not really true. The notion of universal brotherhood, the notion of caring for the stranger, is not a universal value. When I was a young boy growing up in Bombay, now Mumbai, we learned a proverb, which is that the tears of strangers are only water. Water. And that's another way of saying that, yes, we have moral responsibilities to the people around us, to our family, and to our neighbors, and to our relatives, and to our tribe, but not to anyone else. If somebody is outside the tribe and they have a problem, we wish them well, but it's their problem. And if this seems like a kind of a harsh way to feel, this is the way that most of the world feels. If there was a big famine tomorrow in Mongolia or Haiti or Somalia, you'll notice that the Western countries would immediately respond. Doctors Without Borders, the Red Cross, churches sending care packages. Now, there are lots of other wealthy parts of the world, China, parts of India, the oil-rich Middle East. But they would view this event, by and large, with complete indifference. Why? Because to them, compassion, this value that Christianity brought into the world, does not extend that far. There's no such thing as universal brotherhood. When Jefferson sat down to write the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal, he had to reflect upon the idea of why is that self-evident? Where do these rights actually come from? And here's Jefferson, a man of the Enlightenment, perhaps the most skeptical of the generation of the founders, and yet Jefferson, in trying to identify the source of our rights, can think of only one source, a single source, namely the Creator. Rights come from God. And when we think of the great movements of emancipation in Western history and world history, the movement against slavery, for example, remember, slavery was considered normal. It existed all over the world, in China, in India, in ancient Greece and Rome. It's only in Christian civilization that slavery even became controversial. In many cultures, slavery didn't need any defenders because it had no critics. And the reason we got anti-slavery here in the West is because of the Christian idea that we are created equal in the eyes of God. And it was the political translation of this theological truth that gave rise to the really powerful idea in our civilization in America that no man has the right to rule another man without his consent. And you'll notice that this idea that no man has the right to rule another without consent is not only the basis for anti-slavery, but it's also the basis for democracy. Modern democracy is based on the same identical principle that rule of one over another must be by consent. So this is the great shadow that Christianity casts even in secular culture. Even the secular guy, I'm saying, is kind of standing on this Christian mountain. And that's part of what makes modern atheism, even agnosticism, in a sense so strange, because it refuses to acknowledge its own intellectual and moral and even spiritual debt. I mentioned a moment ago that we're living in a more skeptical time, a time where things like belief in God, which was once taken for granted across civilizations and cultures, is now called into question, is now under attack. And it's under attack in the name of a certain kind of skepticism that has now become very powerful, particularly in our schools and universities. Our young people who are, even if they're raised in the church or in the faith, the moment they step out into the world, they're battered by very clever people who, in a strange way, see themselves as evangelists for skepticism. It may seem like a weird thing to be, but these professors and these academics see it as their job to root out what they see as the superstitious faith that parents install in young people. And they're very cunning about it. They'll say things like, young Johnny, young Jane, you know, you call yourself a Christian, but have you done an independent survey and analysis of all the great belief systems of the world? No. You're a Christian because your parents are Christian. You're a Christian because you were born in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or Dallas, Texas, or Vero Beach. But had you been born in Afghanistan, chances are you'd be a Muslim. Had you been born in India, chances are you'd be a Hindu. So your Christianity, so-called, isn't really based on any kind of investigation of the truth. It's just a function of habit, of chance. And so this is the kind of thing that is designed to corrode and shake the confidence of young people today as a prelude to rooting out their Christian faith. I think what this means for us as Christians is the increased need to be able to speak into secular culture, to be able to give an answer to these kinds of objections. Why? Because ultimately we have to be able to give an answer to our own children. We have to be able to explain to them why the faith that we raised them in is actually a faith worth holding on to. Now, remarkably, we live at a time in which the great truths of Christianity, which for centuries were kind of hanging out there to be embraced by faith, are in some ways getting stunning confirmation by great discoveries in modern science and modern knowledge. I mean, think about this. The Bible makes the astounding statement, really in the first book of Genesis, that the world is not eternal. Think about that. The world is not eternal. The universe has not always been there. Aristotle thought it had. Aristotle said that on the basis of reason, this universe has been around forever. And the Bible, the people who wrote the Bible said, no. The universe was actually created. In other words, it did not exist, and then it did. That's a pretty astounding claim. It's pretty astounding because the people who wrote that did no scientific experiments. They basically said, God told us. The universe is not eternal, it was created. And in early church history, you similarly have these astounding statements of fact made by people who would seem to be in no position to know. The church father Augustine once received a letter from a monk who asked him a very interesting question. The monk said to Augustine that if God created the universe at a certain point in time, what was God doing before that? I mean, think about it. If God's eternal, God lives forever, but God created the universe at a certain amount of time, obviously God had a whole bunch of time prior to creating the universe. And so the monk's question was, how did God occupy his time? To which Augustine gave a really incredible answer. He basically said, God did not create the universe in time. God actually created the universe with time. In other words, prior to creating the universe, there was no time. Once upon a time, time did not exist. Now, this is written in the 4th century AD, that time is a property of the universe. Now, I tell you this because if you walk into Introductory Physics 101 at Texas A&M or UCLA, you will learn as two of the most remarkable findings of modern science occurring really in the last 100 years. Number one, that the universe came into existence with a single primordial explosion, sometimes colloquially known as the Big Bang, and that the Big Bang not only resulted in the creation of all matter and all the laws of the universe, but time itself is a property of the universe. Beyond the universe, there are no laws. Beyond the universe, there is no time. So we see today in our own lifetime incredible and stunning confirmation of things that Christians and Jews wrote in the 6th or 7th century before Christ. This is the Old Testament, and then said in the immediate centuries after Christ's death. It's really a wonderful time to be alive, because these Christian beliefs of ours that I say have been sort of held solely by faith for many, many centuries can now be seen as supported, corroborated, confirmed by astounding findings of modern knowledge in the world today. The problem for atheism that the atheists never like to acknowledge is that their own belief system is also based on faith. They never want to admit this. A few years ago, I saw the rise of the new atheism with figures like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. I knew Hitchens from my days in Washington, D.C., and so we ended up doing a series of debates on Christianity, very often not in a church environment, but in the campus environment, in front of young people. And I remember particularly one of these debates where Hitchens, very much in his very scornful mode, he goes, "Dinesh, you Christians have basically lost your minds." He goes, "I'm not saying that you're completely irrational, because in things that have nothing to do with your faith, you live like a rational person. If somebody were to tell you, challenge you on a matter of fact, you would check to see if the fact is true. But he said, but when it comes to your faith, you basically believe all kinds of complete nonsense without a shred of evidence behind it." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he said, "Well, let me give you an example. Do you believe in life after death?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "Well, there you go." He goes, "Have you been to the other side of the curtain? Have you interviewed any dead guys?" "No. You have absolutely no idea if there's life after death, but you go around saying that claiming that there is. In other words, here is a fact that you assert that has absolutely no evidence going for it. It reveals the kind of unthinking belief system that seems to guide your life." And he goes, "Why don't you join me in having a life based upon skepticism, based upon knowledge, based upon evidence, based upon truth, not based upon pie in the sky and Santa Claus and wishful thinking and made-up stuff?" And I said to him, "Well, Christopher, let me ask you a question. Do you believe in life after death?" He goes, "Absolutely not. I'm a skeptic." I go, "Have you been to the other side of the curtain? Have you interviewed any dead guys?" No. "So what knowledge do you have that I lack?" None. None. The point is that here we are flung into the world. And there's a lot we know about the world we're in, but there's a whole lot we don't know. And in fact, some of the biggest questions that a reasonable person would ask about the world, not only do we not know, but we can't know. And when I say we can't know on the basis of unassisted human reason. How did the world get here? Who made it? Why are we here? What's the point of our life? What happens after we die? These are all questions that are obviously extremely important to any human life, and yet, how do we even go about answering them? What experiments can we perform to even know the answer? The point is that the atheist and the Christian are both making a leap of faith. But here's the key difference, and this is what I pointed out to Hitchens. I said, look, the Christian at least is honest enough and humble enough to admit that my position, that there's life after death, my hope that there is an everlasting life waiting for me, I at least admit that there is faith that goes into that. But what distinguishes the atheist from the Christian is that the atheist, poor deluded guy, is also making a leap of faith, but continues obstinately and foolishly to insist, my position is based on evidence, even though there is no evidence unavailable to the Christian. You know, if we're going to be reasonable about things, people talk about is faith reasonable? If you're going to talk about the reasonableness of faith, the first question you have to ask, and I actually learned this from the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant is very good on all this, and he talks about the fact, one of my favorite quotations from Kant is, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. It's Kant's way of saying that human nature is a little bent, it's a little warped. And so we have to design economic and political and social systems that acknowledge that are based on that realistic perception of human nature. If you ignore what human nature actually is, you're going to come up with ideas that don't really work very well in the world. But the greatest contribution of Kant, philosophically, and I'm going to get philosophical only for a minute or two, is actually to say that before we talk about reason, we need to know the boundaries of reason. In other words, we need to know where reason cannot travel. There's no point trying to apply reason where reason can't go. But where is it that reason can't go? And what Kant does is he actually shows that our perception of the world, even the simple things in the world, is actually very limited. He gives a very telling example, and I'm going to adapt the example to our own situation. If I were to go, for example, and stand on the beach, and what do I perceive out there? I perceive the ocean. But how do I perceive the ocean? I mean, the ocean doesn't jump out and go into my head. How do I actually perceive anything? The way I perceive it is I look at the ocean and my mind constructs a picture, a photograph of the ocean. That's how I perceive it. I perceive it in my head. And now Kant asks a very deep question. How do I know that my perception of the ocean is the same as the ocean itself? In other words, how do I know that the picture in my head resembles the reality that it's supposed to be picturing? I mean, think about this for just a minute. Normally, how do we know that two things are similar to each other? If somebody told me, here's a painting, here's the official portrait of Barack Obama. How do I know if this is actually Obama Well, I need two things. I need the portrait and I need Obama. I need to look at the portrait and then I need to look at Obama and see if the two match. And if they match, I can go, yeah, that's a really good portrait. Looks exactly like Obama. But I need both to do that. But Kant's point is that if I'm standing in front of the ocean and I make in my head a picture of the ocean, I actually only have one thing, the picture. I don't actually have the ocean. I only have the picture I've made in my head, and I can't compare it to anything. In other words, what Kant is actually saying is that when we experience the world, we have only our perception of the world. But the world in itself, the world as it is outside. All right. This is just another way of saying something that all the great religions of the world have always said, and that is, we have the world, we have our perception of the world, but there is a world behind the world. There is another world that we are only dimly aware of, that we see, as the Bible says, through a glass darkly. And human reason can only, you may say, get a whiff of that world. Kant calls it the noumenal world. And so this is the way in which, again, not modern physics in this case, but modern philosophy is beginning to reach out to what we can call the invisible, the eternal, or the transcendent. The transcendent. But I now want to talk for a moment about Christianity. I grew up in a society in which there were many different faiths. Muslims, Christians, Hindus, Jains, and so on. And I had to think to myself, because we Christians were in the minority, and I had to think to myself, what makes us right and them wrong? I can't say it's because we have the Bible, because they would reply, we have the Quran. And so, just as I can quote from the Bible, they can quote from the Quran. How do we adjudicate between them? What makes Christianity different? I want to say a word about that, because I've been thinking about that most of my adult life. And I think what makes Christianity different is that Christianity has a completely different take than any other religion on what might be called the human problem. By the human problem, I mean the problem universal to all human beings. And that human problem can be summed up very simply in this way. I'll begin by simply saying the phrase that things in the world are not as they ought to be. Things in the world are not the way they ought to be. And I think everybody would agree. I've never met anyone who disagrees that things in the world are not the way they ought to be. But that is another way of saying that the world is over here. This is the way things are. And there's another level that everyone can envision, and that is up here. That's the way things ought to be. Perfect goodness, perfect truth, perfect beauty. This is the way things should be. This is the way things actually are. And so the big human question is, how do we get from here to here? How do we reach, you might say, the divine level? The level of goodness, of perfection, of truth. Now, all the religions of the world in different ways give the following answer to this human problem. That the way that you cross this divide, this chasm, if you will, is you construct a kind of ladder. It's a ladder of do's and don'ts. It's a ladder of the way you should be, but you need to do these things in order to go step by step across this huge divide to try to reach, you might say, God, heaven, perfection, goodness. And Christianity is unique in that it essentially steps back and says, no, This project of trying to construct human ladders to God is impossible. It's a failure from the outset. Not to say that you can't put up a ladder, not to say that some guys won't get to the 3rd step or the 7th step, and some people will be higher than others, but in the end it doesn't matter because the gap is too big. The chasm is too large, and that it's possible that the chasm cannot be crossed at all, but if it can be crossed, the only way for it to be crossed is from the other side. In other words, not ladders from man to God, but God reaching down to man. In other words, God has to actually descend or condescend into the world, reach across this huge chasm, and save man. Draw man up, you might say, to him. And God's ambassador to do this is Jesus Christ. So here we are on the verge of Easter. And Easter represents triumph or victory. Good Friday is only the prelude to Easter. Christ's death is only the prelude to his resurrection. And the reason that we celebrate Easter is not only, I've always thought of it, it's a wonderful thing because we are celebrating the great event of Christianity, the resurrection of God, the resurrection of the Son of God, but we're also anticipating our own resurrection. Our own resurrection, which is this astounding promise that resurrection is not just for one, it's for all. It's not just for the Son of God, it's for all of God's children. And the amazing promise of Christianity is that to achieve this resurrection, you know, when I think about Christianity, I think about all the people who are in rebellion against Christianity. I kind of get why there's a rebellion. There's a rebellion, frankly, not because the atheist has done some equations and some experiments and he doesn't see evidence for God. No, the real source of rebellion against Christianity is the rebellion against the idea that there is a divine being that actually has moral oversight over every second of our life. People hate that. They don't want to be under moral oversight. They don't want to be under moral supervision. They don't want someone else telling them what to do. In other words, they want moral freedom. And they see God as the deadly enemy of their moral freedom. This is particularly the main source for people who break away from the faith, particularly in our time. And yet, while Christianity insists that God does have this sovereignty and oversight over our lives, it also offers us the most unbelievably gentle path away from our sins. In other words, in the Christianity, as far as I know, is the only faith, the only religion, the only belief system in the world that says that the way to achieve a complete exoneration for all our offenses and crimes is merely to plead guilty for them and to accept the saving grace of Jesus Christ. That is all we have to do. And by doing that, and by taking that step, we say the great yes to God. We receive the gift that God is freely giving us, and we can participate ourselves in the thrilling experience of being lifted out of our broken bodies and carried heavenward in the marvelous event that is right before us, coming toward us, that Easter represents. And so I think at the end of the day, we need to say to God, yes, you are my Lord, you are my Savior. You are rescuing me not only here in the world, but carrying me to a life beyond with glories greater than I can ever imagine. And for that, what can I say except thank you? Thank you very much.